Good morning, everyone. Today, we're going to speak about the works of Goethe. The past session, we dedicated it to the life of Goethe. Of course, we mentioned some of his works, but today we're going to speak mostly about his works. And the first things that pop into our minds when we think of the works of Goethe are the Werther, which is a short novel that you have. It's an epistolary novel. And what is the other great work? Dr. Faust. Dr. Faust. So those are the two pillars of the works of Goethe. However, something that goes often understated and underappreciated is the lyricism of Goethe. His poetry, precisely because of the language barrier. No matter how good a translator is, it's hard, it's almost impossible to render the effects of Goethe's poetry in a translation. That is why most scholars who study Goethe in Germany delve into his poetry, and of course the source of young Werther and Dr. Faust, while when Goethe is studied abroad in any other non-German speaking country, we focus only on the two main pillars. Being aware of this, I'm going to stress first Dr. Faust, which by the way came a lot later, although its production began even earlier than that of Werther, but it was produced a lot later. It was presented. Goethe was just working on it for a long time. So the first part of this unit, we're going to dedicate it to Dr. Faust. The second part is going to be dedicated to the sorrows of young Werther, and it is there where I will expand the most. And finally, just so you get a taste, I will read you and make a few comments on one of Goethe's poems. Okay, so that is our program for today. Dr. Faust. When we were looking at the sorrows of young Werther, we saw that in it we find a prophecy and an outline for the entire 19th century. And we found the first phase, which is that of a luminous romanticism where everything smiles and nature is fun to us, and we dedicate ourselves to worshiping beauty and worshiping nature, and everything is happy around us. That is the first phase of romanticism. Think of Wordsworth's Dancing Daffodils and young kids, whom we're going to study in our coming session. Then we have the second phase of dark romanticism. Yes, but that is only 2/3 of the work. After Werther's suicide, we still have a long narrative that, in my understanding, would be something corresponding to realism. So we find practically the entirety of the 19th century outlined in the sorrows of young Werther. Now, speaking about Dr. Faust, there I would say we go way beyond the 19th century. It would be too complicated to explain why. I'll give you some hints of why, but since we are still studying the 19th century, it would be too much to explain how Goethe anticipates also the 20th century, but when we get there, you'll see it. And how does he anticipate the 20th century? Mostly through Dr. Faust. Mostly through Dr. Faust. So Goethe goes beyond the 19th century. He in some way anticipates the vanguard movements that would flourish during the 20th century. And I'll give you some hints of why, while don't expect this to be exhaustive. Okay? because it would be too elaborate. What can we say about the sorrows of, what can we say about Dr. Faust? It was published in two parts. The first part was published during Goethe's lifetime, and from the very beginning it was called First Part. In that way, he was giving us a hint, he was giving us an inkling into the fact that there would come a second part. That second part, Goethe finished it, but he didn't see it performed on stage during his lifetime. In the preface, we find practically the whole plot, or at least an element that has a lot to do and explains the plot, because if we don't look at the preface, like, we miss what's happening. In the preface, we find God speaking with Satan. Does that re-echo something you know of? The book of Job, exactly, the book of Job, where Satan, which in Hebrew is Shatan, and it means the accuser, comes before God. God shows him how faithful Job is, and then God allows Satan to tempt him, to trouble him, to see if his fidelity would stand. So that is what happens through the book of Job, and Job is faithful, even when he is deprived from all his wealth, all his possessions, and even his own health. In Dr. Faust, we find the complete inversion of this. Again, we find Dr. Faust and God and the devil contend for his soul, but what does the devil do in this case? He overwhelms him with goods to see if that would distract him from his fidelity to God. So he overwhelms him with pleasure and with abundance and with passions that are satisfied with the person of Margarita, with power, with richness, with knowledge. And Dr. Faust receives all of that. However, he remains mostly dissatisfied. In this work, we find profound literary criticism. We find philosophy, we find theology, we find science. So Goethe, in a very skillfully way, intertwines his philosophical tenets, his theological tenets, his knowledge of science, whatever had to do with literary criticism. So many things that were in the atmosphere of his time, he knows how to blend them together into this work. It reminds me pretty much of Don Quixote, where in the dialogues they start speaking about literary criticism, and in that way Cervantes highlights what he thinks about literary criticism. Or in the dialogues they start speaking about religion, or they start speaking about philosophy. So in the end, ultimately, who's giving us his own ideas? Cervantes. I think while Cervantes had great ideas, they look like bumps in the plot of Don Quixote. Instead, with Dr. Faust, they are inserted in a very smooth way. So you don't perceive it as something that is patched into the work, but please be aware of this. Goethe inserts lots of his own ideas about science, about religion, about theology, about philosophy, and about literary criticism, and many other topics. He inserts them very skillfully into Dr. Faust. Dr. Faust is never satisfied. Nothing can satisfy him. And in that, Goethe reflects modern man. To some extent, we are all we all resemble Dr. Faust, meaning we are always longing for more. We are never satisfied. And never satisfied in what we experience with our senses, never satisfied in what we get to know, because once we know something, what do? We want to know more. Once we experience something, we want to know, we want to experience more. Once we receive affection, we want more. So that is that sense of modern man who's never satisfied is very well depicted in Dr. Faust. It has two parts, and the first part is quite crazy, meaning it goes beyond any literary standard in his time. You already know that Shakespeare didn't fit within the conventional models, and Shakespeare was pretty much unknown in Germany at the time. And it is through Werther that Goethe becomes familiarized with the works of Shakespeare, and I think he draws inspiration in Shakespeare's unconventional style to push it way beyond anything that had been ever conceived before that. So the first part of Dr. Faust is crazy, but if the first part is crazy, the second is completely wild. You cannot even devise a plot when you're reading the second part. Other than the persistence of the two main characters, Dr. Faust and Mephisto. Those are the two main characters, which, although they are antagonistic, at the end they become like a couple that cannot be separated. Think of Don Quixote and Sancho. They both represent these different aspects of human life. Right? Dr. Faust is grandiloquent, he's elegant, he is sophisticated. Mephisto is funny, and he is craving always after low passions. Instead, Dr. Faust is someone elegant. So their styles conflict, and that creates one of the greatest couples in literature. So the persistence of Mephisto and of Dr. Faust could be the only unifying element in the second part of Dr. Faust. Furthermore, Dr. Faust sometimes is absent, meaning he's in the room next door, he's asleep, or he's not even there. So the one who's advancing the plot is Mephisto. From the preface, Goethe warns us, don't look for coherence. Don't look for a straight plot line. Because Dr. Faust is not meant for us to find some coherent development. Dr. Faust is meant for us to just enjoy. It is meant for aesthetic delight. Of course, you've heard of Kant, the philosopher. So, two of his major works are The Critic of Pure Reason and The Critic of Practical Reason. But there's also a major work by Kant, which is The Critic of Judgment. When we have an aesthetic experience, think, for example, looking at a masterpiece, at a great painting, or listening to Mozart's Requiem. When we have those aesthetic experiences, our practical reason falters. What is the purpose of this? Our pure reason also falters, right? It's not like we can conceptualize this. In the moment that you conceptualize beauty, you take it out of its element and you distort it. So it's just letting ourselves be drawn into the flow of this aesthetical experience. And that is the purpose of Dr. Faust. It is meant for us just to enjoy, to have the delight of an aesthetical experience rather than find a cohesive plot line. I'm about to finish what I had to say about Dr. Faust. Of course, there's much more to say, but I want to cover to some extent, in as much as it's possible, also the source of young Werther and some of his poetry. So I have to move on. But before I finish, how does Goethe anticipate the vanguard movements that would flourish during the 20th century? Maybe even a little before the turn of the century. I can give you two examples. First, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde lived in the 18th century. Sorry, in the 19th century. He died in 1900. But in him, we don't find a realist. We already find an author who anticipates the vanguard movements. And of course, his most famous work is the picture of Dorian Gray, where there's some kind of bargain with the main character, Dorian, who agrees to have the picture subject to decay, while he would remain in the peak of his youth. Don't you see that bargain something that we can also find in Dr. Faust? There's a bargain. And in this way, we can say that Goethe anticipates the vanguard movements. Furthermore, when we come to the 20th century with James Joyce and his stream of consciousness, some have said that Dr. Faust's second part goes way beyond that. So again, don't look for a straight narrative. Don't look for a plot line in it. Just let yourself be drawn by the flow of the experience. The Sorrows of Young Werther. It is one of the first things that should strike us is how different it is from Dr. Faust. You can say that it is the complete inversion of Dr. Faust. While in Dr. Faust we find a very intricate complexity, in the Sorrows of Young Werther we find extreme simplicity. Guy meets girl, unrequited love, suicide. The end. It's as simple as that. Can you see it? It's a very, very simple plot line. When I say it's simple, it doesn't mean it's simplistic or dull. He wrote it in 1774 when he was 24. And he wrote it in 2 months. So those were 2 months that were very, very well employed. Yeah, you can think of the greatness of Goethe at the age of 24 writing this novel that has become a classical for universal literature in 2 months. Just like all Italian literature has to resort and look back to Dante, all English literature has to resort and look back to Shakespeare, all German literature has to look back and resort to Goethe. And he was 24. He published it with 25, but he became a celebrity. And let me begin with stressing how this is not a romantic story. However, it's not a neoclassical story. It's something in between. You will find some scholars who will argue that this belongs completely to the Weimar Classicism. Some others will argue that it belongs completely to the Romantic movement. So what should that tell us? That it's something in between. How is it something in between? Maybe in elementary school or in high school, when you study literary movements, you study them with the law of pendulum, right? So we had medieval thinking that was all centered into God, and then we discovered the classics. So we have the Renaissance that is completely centered into man, right? And they followed the the standards of Greek and Roman art, which were balanced. So then they said, oh, that's too balanced. So what do? We shift through to the Baroque. And in the Baroque, we have exuberance. We have excesses. Yes, we have majesty. And what happens then? Yeah, exactly. They say that is too much. Some push it forward all the way to Rococo, but we say, whoa, that's too much. So let's move to the opposite extreme. So the pendulum goes to the other extreme, which is neoclassicism. And now we have balance, we have harmony, we have measure, we have prudence, right? Yes. And then they say, whoa, that is too cold. Let's go to the other extreme, romanticism, right? Passion, emotion, feelings. And then they say, whoa, that's an excess. Let's go to the other extreme, realism. Let's face reality as it is. And we've all been explained literary movements in that way. There's a part of truth to it, of course, yes. And of course there's reaction from one movement against the other. That is what creates something new. However, we cannot forget how much each literary movement owes to what preceded it. And if we imagine that the Romantics created something out of scratch, we are wrong. Romanticism owes a lot to neoclassicism. All Romantic authors were well grounded, and they were deeply steeped in neoclassicism. With the blocks of the neoclassical building that they destroyed, they built something new, but they are still using the same blocks. How does Werther owe to neoclassicism? I've mentioned already that the references to Homer cannot go unnoticed. They are all over the Sorrows of Young Werther. It also reminds me of Seneca. Why? How many of you have read Seneca? Okay, yes, at least one epistle. So from the very word epistle, we should realize that there's something that resembles Seneca. If you remember the preface of the Sorrows of Young Werther, it brings us some kind of advice or consolation that, to my own personal taste, resembles Seneca very much. And remember that Seneca mostly wrote through epistles. Here we have an epistolary novel. The Confessions of St. Augustine. Someone who's very introspective, delving into himself. In addition, think of how much the Sorrows of Young Werther reveals about human nature. And let alone the plot. The plot is very profound. It's simple, but it's profound. But just pay attention to the little quotes that you find scattered through the work here and there. For example, almost in the beginning, it says, misunderstanding causes more harm than malice. Isn't that a profound truth that reveals something about our human condition? And I think it's very accurate. Or, why can't art depart from nature? He asks himself. So all those little questions that you find here and there reveal something profound and something classical. Goethe owes a lot to neoclassicism. We can also see that it is very autobiographical. Let me rephrase. It is too autobiographical. Later on, Goethe would confess he shot his hero to spare himself. I repeat, Goethe killed his own hero. He had Werther killed to save himself. Because he had fallen in love with Charlotte Boeuf, the name Charlotte Lotte. Okay? She was an orphan who took care of her 11 siblings. Does that remind you of someone? Lotte, who took care of her 8 siblings. The number changes, but it's the same situation to a significant extent. Goethe. I'm speaking about the historic Goethe, not about literary fiction. Goethe had led a pretty comfortable life. And when he encounters Charlotte Boeuf, he finds someone who actually struggles. And that impressed him profoundly. And he fell in love with her, knowing that she was already engaged to his friend, Kästner. He was like the third wheel in the relationship. Kästner was a little hands-off and let Charlotte Boeuf decide. Charlotte was not interested in Goethe. So Goethe had to leave. And he distilled his own personal emotion and his heartbreak into this great work. In addition, Kästner had lended his pistols to another friend, Jerusalem. I think his name was Wilhelm Jerusalem, who committed suicide with those pistols. So when the novel came out, Charlotte and Kästner were profoundly offended because they saw themselves too reflected in this piece of work. So there are many autobiographical references. I've given you just the external appearances, but this represents an internal struggle that Goethe himself experienced. Just a quick thought. I'm going to divert a little, but I think it's worth highlighting this. I think experience is overrated. Let me repeat. I think experience is overrated.
What is that?
It's valued way more than what it actually is. When you study something and people tell you, oh yeah, those are just your studies, but I've had the experience. Oh yeah, sure. Yes, experience for me, without reflection, is like what we receive through our senses without intellect. So no matter how many experiences you have, they are worthless unless you reflect about them. Heartbreaks, they happen every day. Millions of them have happened through human history. But that doesn't mean that we end up with a work like The Sorrows of Young Werther. Experience of itself, it's worthless. What really matters is how you reflect on that experience. Let me come back now to the outline. Werther is he's crazy and he's emotional, so he's the prototype of a romantic hero. His counterpart is that of Albert. He belongs to the aristocracy. He's balanced. He's prudent. And they both reflect the conflict between reason and feelings. And who decides? Charlotte. She's caught in this love triangle, like the Phantom of the Opera. Christine has to decide between leading a family life or leading an artistic life. Between Raoul, who's promising her wealth and stability, and the phantom, who's offering her an artistic career. So that tension between two extremes that might seem opposite, we find it reflected to some extent in the sorrows of young Werther. We find that tension between a comfortable life and following one's own dream, one's passion. I think Charlotte, deep inside, resonates a lot more with Werther than with Albert. But at the same time, she's too conventional. She's too grounded in the moral standards of her time to pursue her passion. A few decades later, we would have Madame Bovary by Flaubert and Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, who invert the plot. They do follow their passions, but let's stay now here with Werther. Werther is in love with her. That makes him totally subjective. And we find only one narrative. We don't expect Werther to give us an objective account of what happened. Charlotte, what's her charm? Is there any charm in her other than that which Werther places in her? One of the lines that catches my attention the most is maybe halfway through the novel, when he says goodbye to her. She gets on the carriage, and the carriage drives away. He sees her going away in the carriage, exactly, and she moves her head like this. Okay? And he says, maybe she thought about turning back and looking at me. Maybe she just wanted to scratch herself. But how subjective this is, and how he blows this out of any proportion and makes this something that resonates so profoundly within him. It's his own subjective narrative. That speaks very eloquently about a person who's in love who will not listen to anyone. His subjectivism becomes his world. That is why we have never a response to Wilhelm. Werther is writing all the letters. Imagine Wilhelm should write to him. And imagine Wilhelm should say, okay, yeah, but I think you are overreacting. I think you are taking things way out of proportion. I think you should do this or that. If Wilhelm ever wrote back, no one cares, because Werther would not listen. He never mentions, oh yeah, as you mentioned in your letter. Wilhelm is just the background. It's just the occasion for Werther to write his letters. That's why we have a one-sided story. A question, brother?
Yes, I was going to say, is it Wilhelm? Like the other brother? Could he be the representation of maybe his conscience, trying to move him alongside and trying to convince himself of the other one?
Would Wilhelm be the reflection of someone inside Werther? But it would be absolutely silent. I don't see it clearly. It might be. Yes, maybe he was writing to himself to find if there would be something resonating in him, but he pushes this to the ultimate consequences. And in Werther, we have a romantic hero where there's no sense of proportion, for whom dying is a glorious ideal. While Albert, who's like 20 years Werther's senior, that's why he doesn't mind him. He knows Werther doesn't stand a chance before Charlotte because of his age and because of his social background. In him we have stability. He is making financial gain. Instead, in Werther, we find that passion, live your dream, follow your feelings. And there comes a point where Albert asks him, like, when are you gonna settle? When are you gonna make a living? And he tries to help him and lead him into that direction, which Werther at some point follows, but he's completely dissatisfied with that style of life, and he comes back. And that's his doom. That's his perdition. He came back. So ultimately, in the source of young Werther, we find how he unravels, how he goes from crazy to crazier. He becomes completely deranged. There's not a single moment of calm. Well, yes. What is that moment of calm? What's just before his suicide? That is the only thing he reflects about. He thinks well how he's gonna do it, but we see how that passion becomes only more and more intense during the plot. There's a lot of religious ideas in this novel. I've mentioned, when I spoke about Goethe's life, how he had followed some pietism, how he had become familiarized with it, that was looking for some mystical experience. What Goethe does is secularize this mystical experience. And what is Werther's mystical experience? His encounter with Charlotte. How does he meet Charlotte? At the breaking of the bread. Does that sound familiar? Remember Luke's gospel after the resurrection, when they discovered, when they recognized Jesus at the breaking of the bread? Well, she was breaking the bread for her siblings. We also find that pantheistic view where nature, man, and God are all not only connected, but they are one and the same thing. In Charlotte, we find the eternal feminine that becomes an idol. Moreover, it is not Charlotte Werther worships. Whom does she actually worship? He worships himself, and he worships the idea he has made of Charlotte. Oh, you should see her dance. Oh, you should listen to her playing the piano. Maybe she only knew one song or two. I don't think she was a great piano player, but Werther exalts her. He enshrines her, and he ends up worshipping the idol he had created. He turns her into a Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman for whom everything, every pain, every war, even death is worth it. In Charlotte, we also find a reflection of Penelope, because she's a faithful wife, right? She's a faithful bride. And she's a loving mother, like Penelope is to Telemachus. However, Penelope doesn't drive away the suitors, which leads them to doom. And Werther compares himself to the suitors in the Odyssey. He knows he's following his passions. So to use another Homeric symbol, Penelope ultimately becomes a siren. How did Werther die? He committed suicide when? At midnight.
Yeah.
After his last supper, where he had bread and wine. It's an inversion. It's almost like a black mass, which doesn't open us to hope, but opens us to despair. What is said about the funeral of Werther? No clergyman attended. No clergyman attended because he has no ministers. He is his own priest. I still want to read you a poem. No, I don't have time. Let me just finish this well, and next class, before I start talking about young kids, I'll read you a poem by Goethe, okay? So, as you know, this work catapulted Goethe to the heights of fame. No other writer his age was as famous as he was. This started also what's called like the Werther phenomenon, where it means people started dressing up, wearing jackets and wearing boots and imitating the outfit Goethe describes in his novel. The book got translated to practically all European languages. It's remarkable, for example, that Mary Shelley mentions the sorrows of young Werther in her Frankenstein. And notice that not so much time had elapsed. Goethe was still alive. I would even dare to say Goethe was still young because he had a long life. It generated a mass suicide to the point where this book was not only influential, it was too influential and it had to be banned. Yeah, The Sorrows of Young Werther was banned. It was prohibited. And Goethe himself, no, by the state. Yes, several states forbid The Sorrows of Young Werther. And Goethe himself agreed with it because as a mature man, he reflects back and he says to himself, I was not aware of the power I would unleash through the writing of this book. Because it's not moralizing. It's not moralizing. It's not a book where, it's not a parable. It's not a fable that teaches us how bad or how destructive it is to follow one's own passions because we end up committing suicide. That is not Goethe's point. That is not Goethe's narrative. What is his point? He not only condones, he glorifies suicide. That is why this book was so destructive. It was way more influential than Goethe himself realized it would become. But well, we ran out of time. Thank you very much for your attention. And next class, even if we are going to dedicate it to young kids, I would like to begin with reading you a short poem by Goethe, so you get also a taste of this third pillar of his work, which is his lyricism. Thank you very much.